Robur the Conqueror, Jules Verne, Part 1. Chapter 1. Mysterious Sounds. Bang, bang. The pistol shots were almost simultaneous. A cow, peacefully grazing 50 yards away, received one of the bullets in her back. She had nothing to do with the quarrel all the same. Neither of the adversaries was hit. Who were these two gentlemen? We do not know, although this would be an excellent opportunity to hand down their names to posterity. All we can say is that the elder was an Englishman and the younger an American, and both of them were old enough to know better. So far as recording in what locality the inoffensive ruminant had just tasted her last tuft of herbage, nothing can be easier. It was on the left bank of Niagara, not far from the suspension bridge which joins the American to the Canadian bank, 3 miles from the falls. The Englishman stepped up to the American. I contend, nevertheless, that it was Rule Britannia. And I say it was Yankee Doodle, replied the young American. The dispute was about to begin again when one of the seconds, doubtless in the interests of the milk trade, interposed. Suppose we say it was Rule Doodle and Yankee Britannia and adjourn to breakfast. This compromise between the national heirs of Great Britain and the United States was adopted to the general satisfaction. The Americans and Englishmen walked up the left bank of the Niagara on their way to Goat Island, the neutral ground between the falls. Let us leave them in the presence of the boiled eggs and traditional ham and floods enough of tea to make the cataract jealous, and trouble ourselves no more about them. It is extremely unlikely that we shall again meet with them in this story. Which was right, the Englishman or the American? It is not easy to say. Anyhow, the duel shows how great was the excitement, not only in the New, but also in the Old World, with regard to an inexplicable phenomenon which for a month or more had driven everybody to distraction. Never had the sky been so much looked at since the appearance of man on the terrestrial globe. The night before, an aerial trumpet had blared its brazen notes through space immediately over that part of Canada between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. Some people had heard those notes as Yankee Doodle, others had heard them as Rule Britannia, and hence the quarrel between the Anglo-Saxons, which ended with the breakfast on Goat Island. Perhaps it was neither one nor the other of these patriotic tunes, but what was undoubted by all was that these extraordinary sounds had seemed to descend from the sky to the earth. What could it be? Was it some exuberant aeronaut rejoicing on that sonorous instrument of which the renommee makes such obstreperous use? No, there was no balloon and there were no aeronauts. Some strange phenomenon had occurred in the higher zones of the atmosphere, a phenomenon of which neither the nature nor the cause could be explained. Today it appeared over America. 48 hours afterwards it was over Europe. A week later it was in Asia over the Celestial Empire. Hence, in every country of the world, empire, kingdom, or republic, there was anxiety which it was important to allay. If you hear in your house strange and inexplicable noises, do you not at once endeavor to discover the cause? And if your search is in vain, do you not leave your house and take up your quarters in another? But in this case, the house was the terrestrial globe. There are no means of leaving that house for the moon, or Mars, or Venus, or Jupiter, or any other planet of the solar system. And so, of necessity, we have to find out what it is that takes place, not in the infinite void, but within the atmospherical zones. In fact, if there is no air, there is no noise, and as there was a noise, that famous trumpet, to wit, the phenomenon must occur in the air, the density of which invariably diminishes, and which does not extend for more than 6 miles round our spheroid. Naturally, the newspapers took up the question in their thousands and treated it in every form, throwing on it both light and darkness, recording many things about it, true or false, alarming and tranquilizing their readers, as the sale required, and almost driving ordinary people mad. At one blow party, politics dropped unheeded, and the affairs of the world went on none the worse for it. But what could this thing be? There was not an observatory that was not applied to. If an observatory could not give a satisfactory answer, what was the use of observatories? If astronomers, who doubled and tripled the stars 100,000 million miles away, could not explain a phenomenon occurring only a few miles off, what was the use of astronomers? The observatory at Paris was very guarded in what it said. In the mathematical section, they had not thought the statement worth noticing. In the meridional section, they knew nothing about it. In the physical observatory, they had not come across it. In the geodetic section, they had had no observation. In the meteorological section, there had been no record. In the calculating room, they had had nothing to deal with. At any rate, this confession was a frank one, and the same frankness characterized the replies from the observatory of Montsouris and the magnetic station in the park of Saint-Maur. The same respect for the truth distinguished the Bureau des Longitudes. The provinces were slightly more affirmative. Perhaps in the night of the 5th and the morning of the 6th of May, there had appeared a flash of light of electrical origin which lasted about 20 seconds. At the Pic du Midi, this light appeared between 9 and 10 in the evening. At the Meteorological Observatory on the Puy de Dôme, the light had been observed between 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning. At Mont Ventoux in Provence, it had been seen between 2 and 3 o'clock. At Nice, it had been noticed between 3 and 4 o'clock, while at the Semnoz Alps between Annecy, Le Bourget, and Le Léman, it had been detected just as the zenith was paling with the dawn. Now, it evidently would not do to disregard these observations altogether. There could be no doubt that a light had been observed at different places, in succession, at intervals, during some hours. Hence, whether it had been produced from many centres in the terrestrial atmosphere or from one centre, it was plain that the light must have travelled at a speed of over 120 miles an hour. In the United Kingdom there was much perplexity. The observatories were not in agreement. Greenwich would not consent to the proposition of Oxford. They were agreed on one point, however, and that was, it was nothing at all. But said one, it was an optical illusion, while the other contended that it was an acoustical illusion, and so they disputed. Something, however, was, it will be seen, common to both. It was an illusion. Between the Observatory of Berlin and the Observatory of Vienna, the discussion threatened to end in international complications. But Russia, in the person of the director of the observatory at Pulkowa, showed that both were right. It all depended on the point of view from which they attacked the phenomenon, which, though impossible in theory, was possible in practice. In Switzerland, at the observatory of Sautis, in the canton of Appenzell, at the Rigi, at the Gebris, in the passes of the St. Gothard, at the St. Bernard, at the Julier, at the Simplon, at Zurich, at Somblick in the Tyrolean Alps, there was a very strong disinclination to say anything about what nobody could prove, and that was nothing but reasonable. But in Italy, at the meteorological stations on Vesuvius, on Etna in the old Casa Inglesi, at Monte Carlo, the observers made no hesitation in admitting the materiality of the phenomenon, particularly as they had seen it by day in the form of a small cloud of vapour, and by night in that of a shooting star. But of what it was, they knew nothing. Scientists began at last to tire of the mystery, while they continued to disagree about it, and even to frighten the lowly and the ignorant, who, thanks to one of the wisest laws of nature, have formed, form, and will form the immense majority of the world's inhabitants. Astronomers and meteorologists would soon have dropped the subject altogether, had not, on the night of the 26th and 27th, the observatory of Kautokeino at Finnmark in Norway, and during the night of the 28th and 29th, that of Isfjord at Spitzbergen, Norwegian one and Swedish the other, found themselves agreed in recording that in the centre of an aurora borealis there had appeared a sort of huge bird, an aerial monster whose structure they were unable to determine, but who, there was no doubt, was showering off from his body certain corpuscles which exploded like bombs. In Europe not a doubt was thrown on this observation of the stations in Finnmark and Spitzbergen. But what appeared the most phenomenal about it was that the Swedes and Norwegians could find themselves in agreement on any subject whatever. There was a laugh at the asserted discovery in all the observatories of South America, in Brazil, Peru, and La Plata, and in those of Australia at Sydney, Adelaide, and Melbourne, and Australian laughter is very catching. To sum up, only one chief of a meteorological station ventured on a decided answer to this question, notwithstanding the sarcasms that his solution provoked. This was a Chinaman. The director of the observatory at Zikaway, which rises in the center of a vast plateau less than 30 miles from the sea, having an immense horizon and wonderfully pure atmosphere. "It is possible," said he, "that the object was an aviform apparatus, a flying machine." What nonsense! But if the controversy was keen in the Old World, we can imagine what it was like in that portion of the New, of which the United States occupy so vast an area. A Yankee, we know, does not waste time on the road. He takes the street that leads him straight to his end, and the observatories of the American Federation did not hesitate to do their best. If they did not hurl their objectives at each other's heads, it was because they would have had to put them back just when they most wanted to use them. In this much disputed question, the observatories of Washington in the District of Columbia and Cambridge in Massachusetts found themselves opposed by those of Dartmouth College in New Hampshire and Ann Arbor in Michigan. The subject of their dispute was not the nature of the body observed, but the precise moment of its observation. All of them claimed to have seen it the same night, the same hour, the same minute, the same second, although the trajectory of the mysterious voyager took it but a moderate height above the horizon. Now from Massachusetts to Michigan, from New Hampshire to Columbia, the distance is too great for this double observation, made at the same moment, to be considered possible. Dudley at Albany, in the state of New York, and West Point, the military academy, showed that their colleagues were wrong by an elaborate calculation of the right ascension and declination of the aforesaid body. But later on it was discovered that the observers had been deceived in the body, and that what they had seen was an aerolite. This aerolite could not be the object in question, for how could an aerolite blow a trumpet? It was in vain that they tried to get rid of this trumpet as an optical illusion. The ears were no more deceived than the eyes. Something had assuredly been seen, and something had assuredly been heard. In the night of the 12th and 13th of May, a very dark night, the observers at Yale College, in the Sheffield Science School, had been able to take down a few bars of a musical phrase in D major, common time, which gave note for note, rhythm for rhythm, the chorus of the chant du départ. "Good," said the Yankee wags. "There is a French band well up in the air." But to joke is not to answer. Thus said the observatory at Boston, founded by the Atlantic Iron Works Society, whose opinions in matters of astronomy and meteorology began to have much weight in the world of science. Then there intervened the observatory at Cincinnati, founded in 1870 on Mount Lookout, thanks to the generosity of Mr. Kilgore, and known for its micrometrical measurements of double stars. Its director declared with the utmost good faith that there had certainly been something, that a traveling body had shown itself at very short periods, at different points in the atmosphere. But what were the nature of this body, its dimensions, its speed, and its trajectory, it was impossible to say. It was then a journal whose publicity is immense, the New York Herald, received the anonymous contribution hereunder. There will be in the recollection of most people the rivalry which existed a few years ago between the two heirs of the Begum of Raginara, the French doctor Saracen, the city of Frankville, and the German engineer Schulze in the city of Steeltown, both in the south of Oregon in the United States. It will not have been forgotten that, with the object of destroying Frankville, Herr Schulze launched a formidable engine, intended to beat down the town and annihilate it at a single blow. Still less will it be forgotten that this engine, whose initial velocity as it left the mouth of the monster cannon had been erroneously calculated, had flown off at a speed exceeding by 16 times that of ordinary projectiles, or about 450 miles an hour, that it did not fall to the ground, and that it passed into an aerolytic stage so as to circle forever round our globe. Why should not this be the body in question? Very ingenious, Mr. Correspondent on the New York Herald, but how about the trumpet? There was no trumpet in Herr Schulze's projectile. So all the explanations explain nothing, and all the observers had observed in vain. There remained only the suggestion offered by the director of Zikaway, but the opinion of a Chinaman. The discussion continued, and there was no sign of agreement. Then came a short period of rest. Some days elapsed without any object, aerolite or otherwise, being described, and without any trumpet notes being heard in the atmosphere. The body then had fallen on some part of the globe where it had been difficult to trace it. In the sea, perhaps. Had it sunk in the depths of the Atlantic, the Pacific, or the Indian Ocean? What was to be said in this matter? But then, between the 2nd and 9th of June, there came a new series of facts which could not possibly be explained by the unaided existence of a cosmic phenomenon. In a week, the hamburgers at the top of St. Michael's Tower, the Turks on the highest minaret of St. Sophia, the Rouennais at the end of the metal spire of their cathedral, the Strasburgers at the summit of their minster, the Americans on the head of the Liberty statue at the entrance of the Hudson and on the Bunker Hill Monument at Boston, the Chinese at the spike of the Temple of the 400 Genii at Canton, the Hindus on the 16th terrace of the Pyramid of the Temple at Tanjore, the San Pietrini at the Cross of St. Peter's at Rome, the English at the Cross of St. Paul's in London, the Egyptians at the apex of the Great Pyramid of Giza, the Parisians at the lighting conductor of the Iron Tower of the Exposition of 1889, 1,000 feet high, all of them beheld a flag floating from some one of these inaccessible points. And the flag was black, dotted with stars, and it bore a golden sun in its center. Chapter 2. Agreement impossible, and the first who says the contrary. Indeed, but we will say the contrary so long as there is a place to say it in. And in spite of your threats, mind what you are saying, Bat Finn. Mind what you are saying, Uncle Prudent. I maintain that the screw ought to be behind. And so do we, and so do we, replied 100 voices confounded in one. No, it ought to be in front, shouted Phil Evans. In front, roared 50 other voices, with a vigour in no whit less remarkable. We shall never agree. Never, never. Then what is the use of a dispute? It is not a dispute, it is a discussion. One would not have thought so to listen to the taunts, objurgations, and vociferations which filled the lecture room for a good quarter of an hour. The room was one of the largest in the Weldon Institute, the well-known club in Walnut Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, USA. The evening before, there had been an election of a lamplighter, occasioning many public manifestations, noisy meetings, and even interchanges of blows, resulting in an effervescence which had not yet subsided and which would account for some of the excitement just exhibited by the members of the Weldon Institute. For this was merely a meeting of balloonists discussing the burning question of the direction of balloons. In this great saloon there was struggling, pushing, gesticulating, shouting, arguing, disputing, 100 balloonists, all with their hats on, under the authority of a president, assisted by a secretary and treasurer. They were not engineers by profession, but simply amateurs of all that appertained to aerostatics, and they were amateurs in a fury, and especially foes of those who would oppose to aerostats apparatuses heavier than the air, flying machines, aerial ships, or what not. That these people might one day discover the method of guiding balloons is possible. There could be no doubt that their president had considerable difficulty in guiding them. This president, well known in Philadelphia, was the famous Uncle Prudent, Prudent being his family name. There is nothing surprising in America in the qualificative uncle, for you can there be uncle without having either nephew or niece. There they speak of uncle as in other places they speak of father, though the father may have had no children. Uncle Prudent was a personage of consideration, and in spite of his name was well known for his audacity. He was very rich, and that is no drawback even in the United States, and how could it be otherwise when he owned the greater part of the shares in Niagara Falls? A society of engineers had just been founded at Buffalo for working the cataract. It seemed to be an excellent speculation. The 7,500 cubic meters that pass over Niagara in a second would produce 7 millions of horsepower. This enormous power, distributed amongst all the workshops within a radius of 300 miles, would return an annual income of $300 million, of which the greater part would find its way into the pocket of Uncle Prudent. He was a bachelor, he lived quietly, and for his only servant had his valet Fry Colin, who was hardly worthy of being the servant to so audacious a master. Uncle Prudent was rich, and therefore he had friends, as was natural, but he also had enemies, although he was president of the club, among others all those who envied his position. Amongst his bitterest foes we may mention the secretary of the Weldon Institute. This was Phil Evans, who was also very rich, being the manager of the Wheelton Watch Company, an important manufactory, which makes every day 500 movements equal in every respect to the best Swiss workmanship. Phil Evans would have passed for one of the happiest men in the world, and even in the United States, if it had not been for Uncle Prudent. Like him, he was in his 46th year. Like him, of invariable health. Like him, of undoubted boldness. They were two men made to understand each other thoroughly, but they did not, for both were of extreme violence of character. Uncle Prudent was furiously hot. Phil Evans was abnormally cool. And why had not Phil Evans been elected president of the club? The votes were exactly divided between Uncle Prudent and him. 20 times there had been a scrutiny, and 20 times the majority had not declared for either one or the other. The position was embarrassing, and it might have lasted for the lifetime of the candidates. One of the members of the club then proposed a way out of the difficulty. This was Jem Chip, the treasurer of the Weldon Institute. Chip was a confirmed vegetarian, a prescriber of all animal nourishment, of all fermented liquors, half a Mussulman, half a Brahmin. On this occasion, Jem Chip was supported by another member of the club, William T. Forbes, the manager of a large factory where they made glucose by treating rags with sulfuric acid. A man of good standing was this William T. Forbes, the father of two charming girls, Miss Dorothy, called Doll, and Miss Martha, called Matt, who gave the tone to the best society in Philadelphia. It followed, then, on the proposition of Jem Chip, supported by William T. Forbes and others, that it was decided to elect the president on the center point. This mode of election can be applied in all cases when it is desired to elect the most worthy, and a number of Americans of high intelligence are already thinking of employing it in the nomination of the President of the Republic of the United States. On two boards of perfect whiteness, a black line is traced. The length of each of these lines is mathematically the same, for they have been determined with as much accuracy as the base of the first triangle in a trigonometrical survey. That done, the two boards were erected on the same day in the center of the conference room, and the two candidates, each armed with a fine needle, marched towards the board that had fallen to his lot. The man who planted his needle nearest the center of the line would be proclaimed president of the Weldon Institute. The operation must be done at once. No guide marks or trial shots allowed, nothing but sureness of eye. The man must have a compass in his eye, as the saying goes. That was all. Uncle Prudent stuck in his needle at the same moment as Phil Evans did his. Then there began the measurement to discover which of the two competitors had most nearly approached the center. Wonderful! Such had been the precision of the shots that the measures gave no appreciable difference. If they were not exactly in the mathematical center of the line, the distance between the needles was so small as to be invisible to the naked eye. The meeting was much embarrassed. Fortunately, one of the members, Truck Milner, insisted that the measurements should be remade by means of a rule graduated by the micrometrical machine of M. Perot, which can divide a millimeter into 15/100ths of a millimeter with a diamond splinter, was brought to bear on the lines, and on reading the divisions through a microscope, the following were the results. Uncle Prudent had approached the center within less than 6/1500ths of a millimeter. Phil Evans was within 9/1500ths, and that is why Phil Evans was only secretary of the Weldon Institute, whereas Uncle Prudent was president, a difference of 3/1500ths of a millimeter, and on account of it, Phil Evans vowed against Uncle Prudent one of those hatreds which are none the less fierce for being latent. Chapter 3. A visitor is announced. The many experiments made during this last quarter of the 19th century have given considerable impetus to the question of guidable balloons. The cars furnished with propellers attached in 1852 to the aerostats of the elongated form introduced by Henry Giffard, the machines of Dupuy de Lome in 1872, of the Tissandier brothers in 1883, and of Captain Krebs and Renard in 1884 yielded many important results. But if these machines, moving in a medium heavier than themselves, maneuvering under the propulsion of a screw, working at an angle to the direction of the wind, and even against the wind, to return to their point of departure, had been really guidable. They had only succeeded under very favorable conditions. In large, covered halls, their success was perfect. In a calm atmosphere, they did very well. In a light wind of 5 or 6 yards a second, they still moved, but nothing practical had been obtained. Against a miller's wind, 9 yards a second, the machines had remained almost stationary. Against a fresh breeze, 11 yards a second, they would have advanced backwards. In a storm, 27 to 33 yards a second, they would have been blown about like a feather. In a hurricane, 60 yards a second, they would have run the risk of being dashed to pieces. And in one of those cyclones which exceed 100 yards a second, not a fragment of them would have been left. It remained then, even after the striking experiments of Captains Krebs and Renard, that though guidable aerostats had gained a little speed, they could not be kept going in a moderate breeze. Hence the impossibility of making practical use of this mode of aerial locomotion. With regards to the means employed to give the aerostat its motion, a great deal of progress had been made. For the steam engines of Henry Giffard and the muscular force of Dupuy de Lome, electric motors had gradually been substituted. The batteries of bichromate of potassium of the Tissandier brothers had given a speed of 4 yards a second. The dynamo-electric machines of Captain Krebs and Renard had developed a force of 12 horsepower and yielded a speed of 6.5 yards per second. With regard to this motor, engineers and electricians had been approaching more and more to that desideratum which is known as a steam horse in a watch case. Gradually, the results of the pile of which Captains Krebs and Renard had kept the secret had been surpassed, and aeronauts had become able to avail themselves of motors whose lightness increased at the same time as their power. In this, there was much to encourage those who believed in the utilization of guidable balloons. But yet, how many good people there are who refuse to admit the possibility of such a thing. If the aerostat finds support in the air, it belongs to the medium in which it moves. Under such conditions, how can its mass, which offers so much resistance to the currents of the atmosphere, make its way against the wind? In this struggle of the inventors after a light and powerful motor, the Americans had most nearly attained what they sought. A dynamo-electric apparatus, in which a new pile was employed, the composition of which was still a mystery, had been bought from its inventor, a Boston chemist up to then unknown. Calculations made with the greatest care, diagrams drawn with the utmost exactitude, showed that by means of this apparatus, driving a screw of given dimensions, a displacement could be obtained of from 20 to 22 yards a second. Now, this was magnificent. "And it is not dear," said Uncle Prudent, as he handed to the inventor in return for his formal receipt the last installment of the 100,000 paper dollars he had paid for his invention. Immediately, the Weldon Institute set to work. When there comes along a project of practical utility, the money leaps nimbly enough from American pockets. The funds flowed in even without its being necessary to form a syndicate. $300,000 came into the club's account at the first appeal. The work began under the superintendence of the most celebrated aeronaut of the United States, Harry W. Tinder, immortalized by 3 of his ascents out of 1,000, one in which he rose to a height of 12,000 yards, higher than Gay-Lussac, Coxwell, Civet, Crozet-Spinelli, Tissandier, Glacier. Another, in which he had crossed America from New York to San Francisco, exceeding by many hundred leagues the journeys of Nadar, Goddard, and others, to say nothing of that of John Wise, who accomplished 1,150 miles from St. Louis to Jefferson County. The third, which ended in a frightful fall from 1,500 feet at the cost of a slight sprain in the right thumb, while the less fortunate Pilatre de Rosier fell only 700 feet and yet killed himself on the spot. At the time this story begins, the Weldon Institute had got their work well in hand. In the Turner Yard at Philadelphia, there reposed an enormous aerostat, whose strength had been tried by highly compressed air. It well merited the name of the monster balloon. How large was Nadar's Géant? 6,000 cubic meters. How large was John Wise's balloon? 20,000 cubic meters. How large was the Gifford balloon at the 1878 exhibition? 25,000 cubic meters. Compare these three aerostats with the aerial machine of the Weldon Institute, whose volume amounted to 40,000 cubic meters, and you will understand why Uncle Prudent and his colleagues were so justifiably proud of it. This balloon, not being destined for the exploration of the higher strata of the atmosphere, was not called the Excelsior, a name which is rather too much held in honor among the citizens of America. No, it was called simply the Go-Ahead, and all it had to do was to justify its name by going ahead obediently to the wishes of its commander. The dynamo-electric machine, according to the patent purchased by the Weldon Institute, was nearly ready. In less than 6 weeks, the Go-Ahead would start for its first cruise through space. But, as we have seen, all the mechanical difficulties had not been overcome. Many evenings had been devoted to discussing not the form of its screw nor its dimensions, but whether it ought to be put behind, as the Tissandier brothers had done, or before, as Captains Krebs and Renard had done. It is unnecessary to add that the partisans of the two systems had almost come to blows. The group of beforists were equalled in number by the group of behindists. Uncle Prudent, who ought to have given the casting vote, Uncle Prudent, brought up doubtless in the school of Professor Buridan, could not bring himself to decide. Hence the impossibility of getting the screw into place. The dispute might last for some time unless the government interfered, but in the United States the government meddles with private affairs as little as it possibly can. And it is right. Things were in this state at this meeting on the 13th of June, which threatened to end in a riot. Insults exchanged, fisticuffs succeeding the insults, cane thrashing succeeding the fisticuffs, revolver shots succeeding the cane thrashings, when at 37 minutes past 8 there occurred a diversion. The porter of the Weldon Institute, coolly and calmly, like a policeman amid the storm of the meeting, approached the presidential desk. On it he placed a card. He awaited the orders that Uncle Prudent found it convenient to give. Uncle Prudent turned on the steam whistle, which did duty for the presidential bell, for even the Kremlin clock would have struck in vain. But the tumult slackened not. Then the president removed his hat. Thanks to this extreme measure, a semi-silence was obtained. "A communication," said Uncle Prudent, after taking a huge pinch from the snuff-box which never left him. "Speak up," answered 89 voices, accidentally in agreement on this one point. "A stranger, my dear colleagues, asks to be admitted to the meeting." "Never," replied every voice. "He desires to prove to us, it would appear," continued Uncle Prudent, "that to believe in guiding balloons is to believe in the absurdest of utopias." "Let him in! Let him in!" "What is the name of this singular personage?" asked Secretary Phil Evans. "Robur," replied Uncle Prudent. "Robur! Robur! Robur!" yelled the assembly, and the welcome accorded so quickly to the curious name was chiefly due to the Weldon Institute hoping to vent its exasperation on the head of him who bore it. Chapter 4, in which a new character appears. Citizens of the United States, my name is Robur. I am worthy of the name. I am 40 years old, although I look but 30, and I have a constitution of iron, a healthy vigor that nothing can shake, a muscular strength that few can equal, and a digestion that would be thought first class even in an ostrich. They were listening. Yes. The riot was quelled at once by the totally unexpected fashion of the speech. Was this fellow a madman or a hoaxer? Whoever he was, he kept his audience in hand. There was not a whisper in the meeting in which but a few minutes ago the storm was in full fury. And Robur looked the man he said he was. Of middle height and geometric breadth, his figure was a regular trapezium with the greatest of its parallel sides formed by the line of his shoulders. On this line, attached by a robust neck, there rose an enormous spheroidal head. The head of what animal did it resemble from the point of view of passional analogy? The head of a bull, but a bull with an intelligent face. eyes which at the least opposition would glow like coals of fire, and above them a permanent contraction of the superciliary muscle, an invariable sign of extreme energy. Short hair, slightly woolly, with metallic reflections, large chest rising and falling like a smith's bellows, arms, hands, legs, feet, all worthy of the trunk. No moustaches, no whiskers, but a large American goatee, revealing the attachments of the jaw, whose masseter muscles were evidently of formidable strength. It has been calculated, what has not been calculated, that the pressure of the jaw of an ordinary crocodile can reach 400 atmospheres, while that of a hound can only amount to 100. From this, the following curious formula has been deduced. If a kilogram of dog produces 8 kilograms of masseteric force, a kilogram of crocodile could produce 12. Now, a kilogram of the aforesaid Robur would not produce less than 10, so that he came between the dog and the crocodile. From what country did this remarkable specimen come? It was difficult to say. One thing was noticeable, and that was that he expressed himself fluently in English without a trace of the drawling twang that distinguishes the Yankees of New England. He continued, "And now, honorable citizens, for my mental faculties. You see before you an engineer whose nerves are in no way inferior to his muscles. I have no fear of anything or anybody. I have a strength of will that has never had to yield. When I have decided on a thing, all America, all the world, may strive in vain to keep me from it. When I have an idea, I allow no one to share it, and I do not permit any contradiction. I insist on these details, honorable citizens, because it is necessary you should quite understand me. Perhaps you think I am talking too much about myself. It does not matter if you do. And now consider a little before you interrupt me, as I have come to tell you something that you may not be particularly pleased to hear." A sound as of the surf on the beach began to rise along the first row of seats, a sign that the sea would not be long in getting stormy again. "Speak, stranger," said Uncle Prudent, who had some difficulty in restraining himself. And Robur spoke as follows, without troubling himself any more about his audience. "Yes, I know it well. After a century of experiments that have led to nothing, and trials giving no results, there still exist ill-balanced minds who believe in guiding balloons. They imagine that a motor of some sort, electric or otherwise, might be applied to their pretentious skin bags, which are at the mercy of every current in the atmosphere. They persuade themselves that they can be masters of an aerostat, as they can be masters of a ship on the surface of the sea. Because a few inventors in calm or nearly calm weather have succeeded in working an angle with the wind, or even beating to windward in a gentle breeze, they think that the steering of aerial apparatus lighter than the air is a practical matter. Well, now look here. You 100 who believe in the realization of your dreams are throwing your thousands of dollars not into water, but into space. You are fighting the impossible. Strange as it was that at this affirmation the members of the Weldon Institute did not move. Had they become as deaf as they were patient? Or were they reserving themselves to see how far this audacious contradictor would dare to go? Robur continued. "What? A balloon! When to obtain the raising of a couple of pounds, you require a cubic yard of gas. A balloon pretending to resist the wind by aid of its mechanism, when the pressure of a light breeze on a vessel's sails is not less than that of 400 horsepower. When in the accident at the Tay Bridge, you saw the storm produce a pressure of 8,500 weight on a square yard. A balloon, when on such a system, nature has never constructed anything flying, whether furnished with wings like birds, or membranes like certain fish, or certain mammalia." "Mammalia," exclaimed one of the members. "Yes, mammalia, the bat, which flies, if I am not mistaken. Is the gentleman unaware that this flyer is a mammal? Did he ever see an omelette made of bat's eggs?" The interrupter reserved himself for future interruption, and Robur resumed. "But does that mean that man is to give up the conquest of the air and the transformation of the domestic and political manners of the old world by the use of this admirable means of locomotion? By no means. As he has become master of the seas with the ship, by the oar, the sail, the wheel, and the screw, So shall he become master of atmospherical space by apparatus heavier than the air, for it must be heavier to be stronger than the air. And then the assembly exploded. What a broadside of yells escaped from all these mouths, aimed at Robur like the muzzles of so many guns. Was not this hurling a declaration of war into the very camp of the balloonists? Was not this a stirring up of strife between the lighter and the heavier than air? Robur did not even frown. With folded arms he waited bravely till silence was obtained. By a gesture, Uncle Prudent ordered the firing to cease. "Yes," continued Robur, "the future is for the flying machine. The air affords a solid fulcrum. If you will give a column of air an ascensional movement of 45 meters a second, a man can support himself on the top of it if the soles of his boots have a superficies of only the eighth of a square meter, and if the speed be increased to 90 meters, he can walk on it with naked feet. Or if, by means of a screw, you drive a mass of air at this speed, you get the same result." What Robur said had been said before by all the partisans of aviation, whose work slowly but surely is leading on to the solution of the problem. To Ponton d'Amicourt, Lalandelle, Nadar, Deleuze, Delouvrier, Liet, Belleguire, Moreau, the brothers, Richard, Babinet, Jobert, du Temple, Salive, Penaud, de Villeneuve, Gauchot and Tatin, Michael Lou, Edison, Planavergne, and so many others, belongs the honor of having brought forward ideas of such simplicity. Abandoned and resumed times without number, they are sure some day to triumph. To the enemies of aviation, who urge that the bird only sustains himself by warming the air he strikes, their answer is ready. Have they not proved that an eagle weighing 5 kilograms would have to fill 50 cubic meters with his warm fluid merely to sustain himself in space? This is what Robur demonstrated with undeniable logic amid the uproar that arose on all sides. And in conclusion, these are the words he hurled in the faces of the balloonists. "With your aerostats you can do nothing. You will arrive at nothing. You dare do nothing. The boldest of your aeronauts, John Wise, although he has made an aerial voyage of 1,200 miles above the American continent, has had to give up his project of crossing the Atlantic, and you have not advanced one step, not one step, towards your end." "Sir," said the President, who in vain endeavored to keep himself cool, "you forget what was said by our immortal Franklin at the first appearance of the fire balloon. It is but a child, but it will grow. It was but a child, and it has grown." "No, Mr. President, it has not grown. It has got fatter, and this is not the same thing." This was a direct attack on the Weldon Institute, which had decreed, helped, and paid for the making of a monster balloon. And so propositions of the following kind began to fly about the room. "Turn him out. Throw him off the platform. Prove that he is heavier than the air." But these were only words, not means to an end. Robur remained impassible and continued, "There is no progress for your aerostats, my citizen balloonists. Progress is for flying machines. The bird flies, and he is not a balloon. He is a piece of mechanism." "Yes, he flies," exclaimed the fiery Bat-T Finn, "but he flies against all the laws of mechanics." "Indeed," said Robur, shrugging his shoulders, and resuming, "since we have begun the study of the flight of large and small birds, one simple idea has prevailed: to imitate nature, which never makes mistakes. Between the albatross, which gives hardly 10 beats of the wing per minute, between the pelican, which gives 70— 71, said the voice of a scoffer, and the bee, which gives 192 per second. 193, said the facetious individual, and the common housefly, which gives 330 and a half, and the mosquito, which gives millions. Non, milliards. But Robur, the interrupted not his demonstration. "Between these different rates," he continued. "There is a difference," said a voice. "There is a possibility of finding a practical solution." When Deleuze showed that the stag beetle, an insect weighing only 2 grams, could lift a weight of 400 grams, or 200 times its own weight, the problem of aviation was solved. Besides, It has been shown that the wing surface decreases in proportion to the increase of the size and weight of the animal. Hence, we can look forward to such contrivances. Which would never fly, said Secretary Phil Evans. Which have flown, and which will fly, said Robur, without being in the least disconcerted, and which we can call straophores, helicopters, orthopters, or, in imitation of the word neph, which comes from navis, call them from avis, Fs, by means of which man will become the master of space. The helix. Ah, the helix, replied Phil Evans. But the bird has no helix, that we know. So, said Robur, but Penaud has shown that in reality the bird makes a helix, and its flight is helicopteral, and the motor of the future is the screw. From such a malady, Saint Helix keep us free, sung out one of the members, who had accidentally hit upon the air from Harold's Zampa, and they all took up the chorus. From such a malady, Saint Helix keep us free, with such intonations and variations as would have made the French composer groan in his grave. As the last notes died away in a frightful discord, Uncle Prudent took advantage of the momentary calm to say, "Stranger, up to now, we let you speak without interruption." It seemed that for the president of the Weldon Institute, shouts, yells, and catcalls were not interruptions, but only an exchange of arguments. But I may remind you, all the same, that the theory of aviation is condemned beforehand and rejected by the majority of American and foreign engineers. It is a system which was the cause of the death of the Flying Saracen at Constantinople, of the monk Volador at Lisbon, of de Laterne in 1852, of de Groot in 1864, besides the victims I forget since the mythological Icarus. A system, replied Robur, no more to be condemned than that whose martyrology contains the names of Pilat de Rosier at Calais, of Blanchard at Paris, of Donaldson and Grimwood in Lake Michigan, of Civil and of Croce Spinelli, and others whom it takes good care to forget. This was a counter-thrust with a vengeance. Besides, continued Robur, with your balloons as good as you can make them, you will never obtain any speed worth mentioning. It would take you 10 years to go round the world, and a flying machine could do it in a week. Here arose a new tempest of protests and denials, which lasted for 3 long minutes. And then Phil Evans looked up the word. "Mr. Aviator," he said, "you who talk so much of the benefits of aviation, have you ever aviated?" "I have." "And made the conquest of the air?" "Not unlikely." "Hooray for Robur the Conqueror," shouted an ironical voice. "Well, yes, Robur the Conqueror. I accept the name, and I will bear it, for I have a right to it." "We beg to doubt it," said Jem Chip. "Gentlemen," said Robur, and his brows knit, "when I have just seriously stated a serious thing, I do not permit anyone to reply to me by a flat denial, and I shall be glad to know the name of the interrupter." "My name is Chip, and I am a vegetarian." "Citizen Chip," said Robur, "I knew that vegetarians had longer alimentary canals than other men, a good foot longer at the least. That is quite long enough, and so do not compel me to make you any longer by beginning at your ears and throw him out, into the street with him, lynch him, helix him." The rage of the balloonists burst forth at last. They rushed at the platform. Robur disappeared amid a sheaf of hands that were thrown about as if caught in a storm. In vain the steam whistle screamed its fanfares onto the assembly. Philadelphia might well think that a fire was devouring one of its quarters and that all the waters of the Schuylkill could not put it out. Suddenly there was a recoil in the tumult. Robur had put his hands into his pockets and now held them out at the front ranks of the infuriated mob. In each hand was one of those American institutions known as revolvers, which the mere pressure of the fingers is enough to fire, pocket mitrailleuses, in fact, and taking advantage not only of the recoil of his assailants, but also of the silence which accompanied it. "Decidedly," said he, "it was not Amerigo that discovered the New World. It was Cabot. You are not Americans, citizen balloonists. You are only Cabo—" 4 or 5 shots cracked out, fired into space. They hurt nobody. Amid the smoke, the engineer vanished, and when it had thinned away, there was no trace of him. Robur the Conqueror had flown, as if some apparatus of aviation had borne him into the air. Chapter 5. Another disappearance. This was not the first occasion on which, at the end of their stormy discussions, the members of the Weldon Institute had filled Walnut Street and its neighborhood with their tumult. Several times had the inhabitants complained of the noisy way in which the proceedings ended, and more than once had the policeman had to interfere to clear the thoroughfare for the passers-by, who for the most part were supremely indifferent on the question of aerial navigation. But never before had the tumult attained such proportions. Never had the complaints been better founded. Never had the intervention of the police been more necessary. But there was some excuse for the members of the Weldon Institute. They had been attacked in their own house. To these enthusiasts for lighter than air, a no less enthusiast for heavier than air had said things absolutely abhorrent, and at the moment they were about to treat him as he deserved, he had disappeared. So they cried aloud for vengeance. To leave such insults unpunished was impossible to all with American blood in their veins. Had not the sons of Amerigo been called the sons of Cabot? Was not that an insult, as unpardonable as it happened to be just, historically? The members of the club in several groups rushed down Walnut Street, then into the adjoining streets, and then all over the neighborhood. They woke up the householders. They compelled them to search their houses, prepared to indemnify them later on for the outrage on their privacy. Vain were all their trouble and searching. Robur was nowhere to be found. There was no trace of him. He might have gone off in the go-ahead, the balloon of the Institute, for all they could tell. After an hour's hunt, the members had to give in and separate, not before they had agreed to extend their search over the whole territory of the twin Americas that form the new continent. By 11 o'clock, quiet had been restored in the neighborhood of Walnut Street. Philadelphia was able to sink again into that sound sleep which is the privilege of non-manufacturing towns. The different members of the club parted to seek their respective houses. To mention the most distinguished amongst them, William T. Forbes sought his large sugar establishment, where Miss Doll and Miss Matt had prepared for him his evening tea, sweetened with his own glucose. Truck Milner took the road to his factory in the distant suburb, where the engines worked day and night. Treasurer Jim Chip, publicly accused of possessing an alimentary canal 12 inches longer than that of other men, returned to the vegetable soup that was waiting for him. Two of the most important balloonists, two only, did not seem to think of returning so soon to their domicile. They availed themselves of the opportunity to discuss the question with more than usual acrimony. These were the irreconcilables, Uncle Prudent and Phil Evans, the president and secretary of the Weldon Institute. At the door of the club, the valet Fry Colin waited for Uncle Prudent, his master, and at last he went after him, though he cared but little for the subject which had set the two colleagues at loggerheads. It is only in euphemism that the verb discuss can be used to express the way in which the duet between the president and secretary was being performed. As a matter of fact, they were in full wrangle with an energy born of their old rivalry. "No, sir, no," said Phil Evans. "If I had had the honor of being president of the Weldon Institute, there never, no, never, would have been such a scandal." "And what would you have done if you had had the honor?" demanded Uncle Prudent. "I would have stopped the insulter before he had opened his mouth." "It seems to me it would have been impossible to stop him until he had opened his mouth," replied Uncle Prudent. "Not in America, sir, not in America." And exchanging such observations, increasing in bitterness as they went, they walked on through the streets farther and farther from their homes, until they reached a part of the city whence they had to go a long way round to get back. Fry Colin followed, by no means at ease to see his master plunging into such deserted spots. He did not like deserted spots, particularly after midnight. In fact, the darkness was profound, and the moon was only a thin crescent just beginning its monthly life. Fry Colin kept a lookout to the left and right of him to see if he was followed, and he fancied he could see 5 or 6 hulking follows dogging his footsteps. Instinctively he drew nearer to his master, but not for the world would he have dared to break in on the conversation of which the fragments reached him. In short, it so chanced that the president and secretary of the Weldon Institute found themselves on the road to Fairmount Park. In the full heat of their dispute, they crossed the Schuylkill River by the famous Iron Bridge. They met only a few belated wayfarers and pressed on across a wide open tract where the immense prairie was broken every now and then by the patches of thick woodland which make the park different to any other in the world. There Fry Colin's terror became acute, particularly as he saw the 5 or 6 shadows gliding after him across the Schuylkill Bridge. The pupils of his eyes broadened out to the circumference of his iris, and his limbs seemed to diminish as if endowed with the contractility peculiar to the mollusca and certain of the articulate. For Fry Colin, the valet, was an egregious coward. He was a pure South Carolina Negro, with the head of a fool and the carcass of an imbecile. Being only 21, he had never been a slave, not even by birth, but that made no difference to him. Grinning and greedy and idle and a magnificent poltroon, he had been the servant of Uncle Prudent for about 3 years. Over and over again had his master threatened to kick him out, but had kept him on for fear of doing worse. With a master ever ready to venture on the most audacious enterprises, Fry Colin's cowardice had brought him many arduous trials, but he had some compensation. Very little had been said about his gluttony, and still less about his laziness. Ah, valet Fry Colin, if you could only have read the future. Why, oh why, Fry Colin, did you not remain at Boston with the Sneffels, and not have given them up when they talked of going to Switzerland? Was not that a much more suitable place for you than this of Uncle Prudence, where danger was daily welcomed? But here he was, and his master had become used to his faults. He had one advantage, and that was a consideration. Although he was a Negro by birth, he did not speak like a Negro, and nothing is so irritating as that hateful jargon in which all the pronouns are possessive and all the verbs infinitive. Let it be understood, then, that Fry Colin was a thorough coward. And now it was midnight, and the pale crescent of the moon began to sink in the west behind the trees in the park. The rays streaming fitfully through the branches made the shadows darker than ever. Fry Colin looked around him anxiously. "Brr!" he said. "There are those fellows there all the time. Positively, they are getting nearer. Master Uncle," he shouted. It was thus he called the president of the Weldon Institute, and thus did the president desire to be called. At the moment, the dispute of the rivals had reached its maximum, and as they hurled their epithets at each other, they walked faster and faster, and drew farther and farther away from the Schuylkill Bridge. They had reached the center of a wide clump of trees, whose summits were just tipped by the parting rays of the moon. Beyond the trees was a very large clearing, an oval field, a complete amphitheater. Not a hillock was there to hinder the gallop of the horses, not a bush to stop the view of the spectators. And if Uncle Prudent and Phil Evans had not been so deep in their dispute, and had used their eyes as they were accustomed to, they would have found the clearing was not in its usual state. Was it a flour mill that had anchored on it during the night? It looked like it, with its wings and sails, motionless and mysterious in the gathering gloom. But neither the president nor the secretary of the Weldon Institute noticed the strange modification in the landscape of Fairmount Park, and neither did Fry Colin. It seemed to him that the thieves were approaching and preparing for their attack, and he was seized with convulsive fear, paralyzed in his limbs, with every hair he could boast of on the bristle. His terror was extreme. His knees bent under him, but he had just strength enough to exclaim for the last time, "Master Uncle, Master Uncle." "What is the matter with you?" asked Uncle Prudent. Perhaps the disputants would not have been sorry to have relieved their fury at the expense of the unfortunate valet, but they had no time, and neither even had he time to answer. A whistle was heard. A flash of electric light shot across the clearing. A signal, doubtless. The moment had come for the deed of violence. In less time than it takes to tell, 6 men came leaping across from under the trees, 2 onto Uncle Prudent, 2 onto Phil Evans, 2 onto Fry Colin. There was no need for the last 2, for the Negro was incapable of defending himself. The president and secretary of the Weldon Institute, although taken by surprise, would have resisted. They had neither time nor strength to do so. In a second they were rendered speechless by a gag, blind by a bandage, thrown down, pinioned, and carried bodily off across the clearing. What could they think, except that they had fallen into the hands of people who intended to rob them? The people did nothing of the sort, however. They did not even touch Uncle Prudent's pockets, although, according to his custom, they were full of paper dollars. Within a minute of the attack, without a word being passed, Uncle Prudent, Phil Evans, and Fry Colin felt themselves laid gently down, not on the grass, but on a sort of plank that creaked beneath them. They were laid down side by side. A door was shut, and the grating of a bolt in a staple told them that they were prisoners. Then there came a continuous buzzing, a quivering, a frr, with a fr, unending, and that was the only sound that broke the quiet of the night. Great was the excitement next morning in Philadelphia. Very early was it known what had passed at the meeting of the Institute. Everyone knew of the appearance of the mysterious engineer named Robur, Robur the Conqueror, and the tumult among the balloonists and his inexplicable disappearance. But it was quite another thing when all the town heard that the president and secretary of the club had also disappeared during the night. Long and keen was the search in the city and neighborhood. Useless. The newspapers of Philadelphia, the newspapers of Pennsylvania, the newspapers of the United States reported the facts and explained them in 100 ways, not one of which was the right one. Heavy rewards were offered, and placards were pasted up, but all to no purpose. The earth seemed to have opened and bodily swallowed the president and secretary of the Weldon Institute.